Hi, my name's James Field. I'm the Managing Director of CompliSpace. Thank you all for joining us today for this webinar, Enterprise Risk Management for Independent Schools. Just a little bit of housekeeping to deal with at the beginning. On your webinar control panel, you should see a space where you can ask questions. So if you want to type any of those questions in, one of our staff will be receiving those and moderating them. We'll try to get back to you either directly during the course of the presentation, depending on what the question is, and if we're unable to answer those, we'll certainly email you following the presentation and respond to any queries that you might have. What we'll also do is within about 7 days we'll record the webinar, and we'll have this put up on a website, so you'll be also able to view it again, or to let any of your colleagues that wish to view it to be able to do so. Now, just before we start, a little bit about CompliSpace. CompliSpace is a consulting organisation that specialises in providing governance, enterprise risk and compliance services. We operate across a wide range of industry groups, from including education, obviously. And at the heart of what we do, we believe that enterprise risk management programs, for them to work in practice, that organisations must embrace technology, and to this end, our focus is on delivering expert knowledge through technology-driven systems which are designed to create optimal commercial outcomes for our clients. So with that little introduction said, let's get on with the presentation. So this is just an overview of what we're going to be dealing with today. We're going to answer the question at the beginning: what is risk management? We're then going to go on and ask a question of why is it important for schools to practice it. We'll then look at the ISO 31000 standard, which basically sets the benchmark for enterprise risk management in Australia. It's a very important standard for independent schools to understand. And then we'll get into the nitty-gritty of, great, we love the theory, but how do we actually integrate enterprise risk management into our school? Is it a practical thing for us to do? And we'll go through to the end of the presentation and provide you a practical demonstration of risk management and compliance in action. Okay, so what is risk management? Well, there are many definitions out there of what risk management is and what risk are. Essentially, a lot of these are developed around standards. For example, the ISO 31000 International Risk Standard defines risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. I find that all a little bit vague. At the end of the day, it's really important for organisations to understand, the essence of risk management. What does it mean at the ground level? So we've come up with our own definition. So in this case, risk management is a tool, and that's an important part of the process. So it's actually a business tool that is to be used by managers, and it assists organisations to predict future events. Again, really critical. Risk is all about predicting future events. And then using risk management methodologies, once you've identified these potential risk events that may happen in the future, it allows you to follow a structured process where you can address the likelihood of a risk happening and or the impact of that event should it occur. Now, the bottom line is we all practice risk management every day. So if we just take a really simple example, such as a car, and obviously car insurance. So why do you insure your car? You insure your car because at some time in the future you're thinking, well, it might be stolen or I might have a crash. And by taking out insurance, if that was to happen, you are dealing with the potential consequences of that event, and obviously you'll get an insurance refund or get a new car. You could also deal with the likelihood of the event by making sure that you've got good driving skills, or another way would be, to make sure the type of car you buy is not one that is, the most stolen vehicle in Australia, for example. So the bottom line is we all practice risk management every day. Now, risk in schools, though, comes in all different shapes and sizes. So you start with the risks, which I'll call, they're almost certain to occur. So it may be playground bullying, it may be an injury on a sporting field. These things are almost certain to occur at any stage in any school. Then you're looking at other risks which you may consider rare. For example, there's a fire in a school building, or a total IT crash where you lose all your data. much rarer events, but still very real risks for schools. Then you have the type of risks where you don't really want to think about them, and people and organisations generally say, oh, it won't happen to us. You know, things like fraud, or in schools' case, you might have inappropriate behaviour by a teacher. You also have to deal with many outside communities within schools, so it's just not a simple exercise of dealing with what I'd call current clients or the students. And other key risk areas, and I think it's one of the major key risk areas for schools, is compliance. The sheer volume of legislation, rules, organisational processes that schools have to comply with on a daily basis is quite overwhelming. So all of this comes together into a concept called enterprise risk management. So enterprise risk management is making sure that you systematically go through and identify risks within the school. You identify them, you analyse them, and you ultimately control and monitor those risks on an ongoing basis. So enterprise risk is a key component of what should be happening in a school, as opposed to, say, taking a siloed approach to risk management. A lot of schools will say, yes, we practice risk management. When we look at that, often we'll see what they're predominantly doing is dealing with workplace health and safety issues and student duty of care issues, and they're missing a lot of the other key risks that are actually occurring within the school. So let's go on to the next part. Why is risk management important for schools? Well, it's an interesting one. School communities are incredibly complex. Sometimes I look at this and I think that you know, running a commercial enterprise, a normal business, is really, really simple when compared to running a school. So, you know, just have a quick look at this from a focus perspective. Is, you know, obviously we focus on students at the beginning, and then the natural next progression is to think about parents. But within schools, it goes way beyond this. You know, you've then got generations going through schools, so you've got grandparents involved, you've got a whole lot of different stakeholders. You've got staff, whether it be teaching staff or non-teaching staff, and you've got your alumni, your parents associations, and ultimately all of this is pulled together by a board of governors. And even that's intriguing on its own, because whilst schools are incredibly complex enterprises, you know, they often are actually being managed by a voluntary board which is running on a part-time basis, and quite often those board members don't have a great deal of educational experience. So it's a real recipe for a situation where enterprise risk management should be working simply because of the complexities that are involved in schools. So this all happens, but the relationships are there before you even start doing the day-to-day running of a school. For example, you know, disciplining a child, or running a parent-teacher interview where maybe the news isn't so good, supervising children in the playground, excursions, the mountain of office administration that schools have to deal with, and, you know, the checks and balances that have to occur in just about everything that occurs within a school. So why is risk management important? Well, today, the decisions that you make today are ultimately going to impact on the future. That's common sense. But in schools, it's even the risk profile is even more complex than that, because in schools, what's happened in the past can often come back and affect schools in the future. So we often see examples where something that might have happened 50 years ago, 20 years ago, can come back and actually affect a school's reputation today. And that's what it's all about. It's about protecting a school's reputation. And as the slide says, a reputation that took decades to build can be threatened by a single event. So here's a few more practical reasons why enterprise risk management is critical for schools. If I take the first one, workplace health and safety. Workplace health and safety requires all schools, in fact all businesses in Australia full stop, to apply risk management processes. So you need to look at the likelihood of a safety hazard occurring, and you need to look at consider the potential consequences, and you have to put controls in place. For those schools that have have entered into the new harmonised workplace health and safety laws, there's even additional complexity that's been brought in there. So there's a new concept of a PCBU, which is a person conducting a business or undertaking, which is extended obligations for schools to consult when they've got outsourced type arrangements occurring. There's also new concepts of liability for officers within schools. So you've got the due diligence requirement, and you've got the requirement to verify the workplace health and safety systems are actually working. So in short, I think the harmonised laws have really upped the ante as far as workplace health and safety is concerned. They've also upped the ante as far as the requirements to manage your risks effectively within the school. You then have the common law duty of care, where every teacher and school authority owes a duty of care to take reasonable care to ensure that their acts or omissions do not cause reasonably foreseeable injury to pupils. Now again, how do you deal with this? How do you mitigate this risk? Well, the only real way to do that is to adopt risk management practices so you can look into the future, see what may occur, and then manage those risks effectively. Those two first issues are issues that pretty much all schools have to deal with on a regular basis. But then you go into some other areas. So for example, school registration standards. In some jurisdictions, for example in New South Wales and Western Australia, it's quite explicit that schools are required to deal with risk management principles and practice risk management properly. Then in other jurisdictions, and I'll take the ACT for example, you'll find that it's a little bit vaguer in the concept, but all of these standards talk about good governance, they talk about continuous improvement, they talk about innovation, all of which come down to having robust enterprise risk management systems in place. The early childhood framework, which is obviously the new regime, came in on the 1st of January in many jurisdictions, again has similar requirements around governance. It's built on a continuous improvement program, and risk management becomes a vital part of being able to put that in properly. When you look at insurance, it is yet another area, the ability for schools just to get insurance coverage. It's quite interesting. I was looking at one of the major brokers sites that provides services around education and insurance education. So on their site they talk about policies dealing with sexual molestation, bullying, parent groups, excursions, compliance breaches, etc. And they actually say on the site, while there is a solution, while there is an insurance solution for some of these issues, sound risk management practices presents a far better option. So when your insurers are telling you that you should be doing this, I think it's time to really have a very good look at enterprise risk and doing it properly. The other areas, looking at changing expectations. I think everyone will agree that we're in an increasing litigious society. Of course, schools deal with children, and when you're dealing with children, it's only the higher standards of governance that would be expected. If something's gone wrong and your school systems are tested, there really wouldn't be an excuse that would be acceptable to say, oh, we didn't get around to that, or we thought doing that was a little bit expensive, we didn't have the resources. I don't think there'd be reasonable excuses. The other key thing with these changes is what is reasonably foreseeable is changing and increasing consistently. So what was reasonably foreseeable 20 years ago is probably a lot less than what's reasonably foreseeable now. And the reason for that is that there's so much more information available in the world, and there is so much more information available to teachers and to schools as to what types of future events may occur that could affect the school. And whilst we're on that, we're talking about more increasing complex social environments. And whenever you say that, Facebook just pops up as one of the major issues. So Facebook is obviously changing the way in which not only teenagers but all humans generally are interacting and socialising online. The key thing here for schools is they've got to keep pace with these changes. It's not reasonable for them to say, oh, we haven't quite got over the top of that. What's interesting is the law hasn't dealt with it at all. So, for example, if we look at cyberbullying, the law is still a long way behind and hasn't caught up with some of the issues that are having to be dealt with by schools. But that doesn't still, from a school's perspective, they still need to look at what is reasonably foreseeable, and things like cyberbullying are quite reasonably foreseeable, and therefore having policies and procedures around these things and actually implementing them properly are really, really important. So our view on this is, in this technology world we live in, you have got to fight technology with technology, which is what we'll show you towards the end of this presentation. Look, the other sort of factor at the end of, more reasons for enterprise risk management to be taken seriously by schools is the not-for-profit sector reforms. Now, we don't quite know what they're going to be. The governance part of that is still under consultation. But if we were to look in other jurisdictions across other industries, there is a very, pretty much all the regulators have taken the view that enterprise risk management sits at the heart of any good governance program for an organisation, and I doubt whether that's going to be any different within the not-for-profit sector reforms. So one way or the other, I see that within in some jurisdictions you already have to do enterprise risk management, but if you don't specifically have to do it, you're going to have to do it, I think, very shortly. So I like to put things into a visual, and so if I put all of what I've just said into a visual, it's not a very good visual, mind you, but what we're looking at here is what I call the good ship governance. So the blue part is the sea, and this is a very dodgy looking boat that you're sailing along, but it is your governance infrastructure that's keeping you afloat. And your school sits there, and you're in this increasingly complex legal and commercial and social environment as we move forward, which is only going to get more complex, not less complex. Now, the problem for any organisation, and in particular a school, is if there's a crack in your governance infrastructure, what happens? You fall into a different world. Suddenly, the students are picking up what's going on. Immediately, that's going to their parents, and you're talking about microseconds here of text messaging and online communications, and these things are then picked up by the media, they're picked up by local communities, and if things are really gone in a bad way, they're picked up by lawyers, sometimes class action lawyers, and of course regulators are there, but they tend to be towards the back end of those processes. When all of that's come down and your school is sort of experiencing reputational damage, it's extremely difficult to go from here and get back up to there. So as the previous slide said, in a very much a blink of an eye, the school's reputation can be damaged, and it can take years and years to repair the damage that has been done. So how do we deal with risk management? What is it all about? Now, we're going to have a look at the ISO 31000 International Risk Management Standard. I'll tell you at the outset, there are other standards out there, there are other systems out there, but the ISO 31000 standard has really taken a foothold globally as far as, I think, the key risk management standard for dealing with enterprise risk. And from an Australian perspective, the really interesting thing here is Australia led the charge with this. So the original Australian standard, which was published in 1995, was ASNZ 4360. That has actually formed the backbone of the ISO 31000 standard. So Australia's been at the forefront for the last 20 years of building, strong enterprise risk management programs. So enterprise risk management, this is a diagram that's showing you the three key elements of an ISO 31000 risk management program. So there are three elements. The first one is a set of principles, the second is a framework, and the third is a process for managing risk. It's a very small diagram. I'll show you a larger version of that in a second. So let's look at each of these elements, and it's beyond the scope of this particular webinar to go into this in any great detail, but what I'm trying to get across here is there is a very clear method. It's documented, it's well known, not only in Australia but globally, as to how you manage risk. So when people are talking, do you manage risk in your school, they're not talking about, are you sitting around the table chewing the fat and talking about some things that might happen in the future. They're talking about a very structured methodology, which is essentially following the standards such as ISO 31000. So if I look at the first element, which is this 11 risk management principles, think of these essentially as outcomes that you will achieve once you've put your risk management system into place, and it's actually these outcomes that you will know that if they're in place, you'll know that your system's working properly. Now, the first one is it's actually creating some value. Now, you can have a little laugh at that, but how many risk management programs I've seen where there's a lot of time and effort spent creating a document in an Excel spreadsheet, and it's not creating any value for anyone. It's simply a document sitting in a drawer somewhere, and in fact, it causes a lot of frustration as opposed to creating value. This is a really important part of the ISO 31000 standard. It must be fully integrated into the day-to-day management and organisation of your school. What that means is risk management is not something you do once a year. Risk management is a continuous process. It should be fully integrated into the framework and fabric of what you're actually doing in the school. That leads to other elements, such as other principles, such as the continuous improvement principle, the fact that risk management must be dynamic. It should lead to transparency of information, and critically it must be structured and methodical in the way that you're approaching risk management. As I said right at the beginning, risk management is a management tool. It's a system that you can use within senior executive management within the school to actually get some amazing outcomes. Now, that's the first element. The second element is that you have a framework. Just like if you were going to build a house, if you're going to build a risk management framework or a risk management program, you just don't start building and throwing things down. You've got to actually start with a mandate and commitment. And what that means is that the Board of Governors, senior management in the school, have to understand what this is about. They have to understand the journey that they're embarking on and the outcomes that they're actually trying to achieve. Just as if you were building a house. If you started to build without any idea of what you were trying to build, of course the thing would be a failure. So this is a critical first step. The second thing is you need to have a design. Every school is different. Some are large, some are small, some have religious associations, others don't, and so on and so forth. So having a clear design and a plan for your school as far as how risk is going to work is critical as well. And then you've got to get into the implementation process. You've got to understand what that means. You've got to understand concepts of risk maturity, which means that you're not going to build a risk program in a month and suddenly everything's fully integrated and the world's working. It can take quite a long time for this to be achieved as an outcome. And through that period, you must monitor and review what you're actually doing, and ultimately, once you've established an enterprise risk management system that's working, like anything else in the world, you've got to continually improve it to make sure it stays relevant. Now, the third element of a risk management program is referred to as risk management process. Think about this as how you go about managing risk on a day-to-day basis. So, whilst people often refer to this as a sewage treatment diagram, it's actually a very good standard and it's a very good process that's pretty much tried and tested as far as achieving enterprise risk management outcomes. Okay. Now, it's a 7-step process. You start with the concept of communicate and consult. It's very similar to mandate and commitment in the framework. You need to make sure that if you're going to implement an enterprise risk system, you just not doing it in a silo. You need to make sure you've got engagement of senior executive management and the Board of Governors, and you understand what outcomes you're actually going to achieve. That's a critical first step. That step, however, goes all the way through the 7-step process, so you're always communicating and consulting at every step. The second part of the process is called establishing your context. Now, essentially, establishing your context involves Sorry, they're just fixing the audio for a second here. That's right. Establishing the context, really what that equates to is knowing your organisation. In order to practice risk management properly, you've got to understand your organisation intimately, and that might sound like a bit of a no-brainer, but many organisations don't stop to actually look back and see what are their internal and external key drivers. Now, one of the keys is that you're looking at your internal context. So what's the school's strategy? What resources do you have? What are your compliance obligations? What's the culture of the school? All those types of things, right? You then have this concept of key stakeholders, knowing your external environment within your school. So you need to know, for example, parents, past students, target parents. All these things are critical to understand as far as building your risk profile. And of course you've got, within other external environment issues, you've got things like macro environmental type risks. So it could be floods and fire, or it could be, you know, cultural issues, or it could be things like the Gonski report and things like that that may have major impacts on schools. Now, once you've set the context within which you're going to build your risk management framework, the next thing you need to look at is your risk assessment. And this is the sort of guts of risk management, if you like. The key parts I'm going to have a look at are risk identification and risk analysis. And again, this is really high-flying stuff, but just to give you a feel for what risk management's all about. So when we look at risk identification, one of the key things that you must do as a school is build a common risk language. Think of it as a set of categories in which any risk that anyone could possibly name in the school, you'll be able to fit it into a pigeonhole. Why is that really important? Because when you want to analyse that type of risk, say it's human resources risk, or, you know, student enrolment risk, you can go down and really focus on that without the clutter of other issues within the school. Now, why I've highlighted workplace safety and student risk here, student safety risk, is these are the two areas that most schools focus on. When they talk about risk management, this is what they think about, right? What's really critical here is, well, look at all the other risks here that arise that are just as important within the school and can have a major impact on the school. So, you know, if it's the governance infrastructure of the school, the multiple compliance obligations that you have, management of, you know, it could be anywhere 50 to 300 or 400 staff at the real top end. Then you've got things like parent groups and boarding facilities. There are just so many different things that you have to consider within a school, and when you're identifying risks. So there's lots of different ways to identify risk, but I just thought I'd focus on the categorization process that you could see the different types of things that you need to do there. Now, the next part of the risk management process is what they call risk analysis. Now, this is really the heart and soul of risk. It's about talking about, you know, what is the likelihood of a particular event happening? What are the potential consequences if that event was going to occur? So if we just take a simple example, so, you know, you get examples like bullying, allergic reaction, you know, sporting injury. You know, you can say those things are almost certain to happen in most schools. The real question is, what are the consequences or the likely consequences of those things? Now, your overall assessment of the likely consequence is likely to be determined by the effectiveness of the controls that you have in place. And if we take the anaphylactic issue, for example, or the allergic reaction issue, if a school didn't have systems around that, or they hadn't trained their staff, or for example, none of the staff knew how to use an EpiPen, or they just weren't comfortable to do so, or the EpiPens were out of date, all those types of things, the fact is that the almost certain event, when it does happen, may well be catastrophic, because you could end up with the death of a child. Risk management principles say, well, I can identify that as a serious risk in the school, and therefore I must put policies and procedures and training and so on and so forth to make sure that that's done effectively. Okay, so this goes on and on through, you identify all your risks through a process of analysis like this. It's not a thing that comes naturally to most people, but once it is the heart of risk management, and once people get used to doing it, you'll start to see the logic of going through the process. Now, the last three elements of the risk standard I'm just going to quickly go over, but sorry, I apologise, we might be having some audio problems. If you are, we will be re-recording the presentation and sending it through within a week, so if not, please stay with us. Okay. Now these are the other elements. So risk evaluation. Look, the key thing there is that just because a risk is extreme doesn't mean that you need to run and treat it. Because of course what you can have is, you can have extreme risks within the school that have excellent controls. In fact, you can't have a better control. And anaphylactic shock is probably a pretty good example of that. It probably is an extreme risk, but most schools have addressed that because of the nature of the risk. and it may stay as an extreme risk, but it doesn't mean you necessarily have to do any more to control it. You also then, you're putting through your risk treatments and your risk controls and monitoring and reviewing the system. So that's the heart of the ISO 31000 program, and I'm really just going through that partly because our experience, when we did a survey about 12 months or so ago with a group of bursars in a certain state, and what we found, only one of those schools out of 30 odd had actually any familiarity with the ISO 31000 standards. So it's pretty important that schools do understand this, because if anything does go wrong, this is the benchmark that is ultimately going to be put before you as to, well, have you actually practiced risk at this level? So the next part I wanted to deal with is integrating enterprise risk management into your school. So now we get down to the practical stuff. Great, loved all the theory, but how do I actually do this in my school? Now the first thing I want to just point out to you is the differences between risk and compliance. They are two very distinct concepts and programs, but they work intricately together. So risk is all about looking into the future, as we've said, and as you go through, your risk profile will change consistently. There's for example, you might enter into buy a new computer system, or decide that you're going to grow your student numbers from 600 to 800 or whatever it is. The risk profile of the school changes depending on what your strategic objectives are. And as soon as you've started to do these things, your compliance obligations can change as well. So suddenly issues around enrollment and how you're actually managing your compliance become critical. So compliance is basically broken up into three different areas. One is legal and regulatory compliance, and we know there's an awful lot of that in schools. The second one is organisational compliance, and the third one is contractual compliance. And I think you'll all recognise those individually. The key is when you're doing these, when you're building a system, is to make sure that you do have clear delineation between the different compliance types. Now I'll just add complaints into the mix, because complaints, I'm pretty sure that every one of the registration standards around Australia, I haven't looked at them all, but certainly the ones that I have looked at, complaints is a key part of that. I know it is under the early childhood national quality standards as well, and also for dealing with international students. So complaints are critical because firstly what they tend to do is they indicate to you that there's been a compliance breach that's occurred. Usually when someone's complaining, it's because a system or process hasn't been followed within the school. And the other part of complaints is that they provide a fantastic risk indicator. So if someone could be bothered to complain to you, they're unhappy about the feedback, that indicates that you're not doing something right, and that's indicating that there's a potential risk. It could be something as simple as teachers not updating the student intranet with the latest copies of assessment papers and due dates. That can create chaos within a family on a weekend when they're trying to work out what their 5 kids are going to do, and that could lead to a complaint to the school. Not properly dealt with, that can create reputational damage and so on and so forth, and it can certainly cause dissatisfaction among parent group. So complaints are a key part of the process that schools need to deal with, and that's why it's written into the standards. Now the other part, and I can't emphasise this enough, is that you've got a risk policy framework, and managing risks, as it says here, the best way to manage risks, or the most appropriate way, is to have a policy and procedure that makes it very clear how to manage that risk. So again, taking allergic reactions, where you have those issues, most schools will have quite a detailed policy on how to deal with anaphylactic shock, and we'll push that all the way through to having trained their staff and having assurance systems in place, because it's such a key risk. But policies and procedures go right across the board, and as you can see up here, there's such a range of policies and procedures. Now the key from our perspective is to avoid siloed policy drafting. So all of these different policy element areas all link with each other. For example, workplace health and safety is risk-based, as is student duty of care, as is obviously enterprise risk, as is fraud, as is BCM, which is business continuity management. Now if you look at all of those different things, what we often find is a school has had a consultant come in to write a business continuity program but really hasn't looked at any other aspect of the policies in the school. They're then siloed, they then don't tend to work properly. So you've got to get all of your policies, we'll use the concept of horizontal integration of policies to make sure that they're all linked. And the second part of the policy framework is what I'll call vertical integration of policies, and this is probably the most important part. Let's take risk as an example. So you might start with a statement of intent at a board level that we're going to manage risk. Now, of course, if you just make a grand statement saying, oh, the school, is going to manage risk and we're very passionate about it, that actually does no one any good at all, because you haven't implemented anything. So the next stage you probably need to go down to is the drafting of a risk program itself. Okay. Now at that stage, the risk program is going to tell you why are we actually doing risk management, who's responsible for it, how are we categorizing our risks, for example, what type of reporting outcomes are we looking for. So the risk management, documented risk management program is absolutely critical as part of the risk process. But still, having a risk program and sitting on the PDF document on a D drive isn't going to do anybody any good either. So the next thing is you've got to make risk management come alive. You've got to identify the risks, both at a micro and macro level in an organisation. Now, in some organisations, they'll do this through an Excel spreadsheet, and I'll show you why later that can't work either. But having a risk register is the next part. And of course, once you've identified the risks, you've got to write an organisational policy to manage a particular risk. So the example here is just excursions. So we've identified the risks through the risk framework and we implement a policy around that. But that's still more. We've got to go down another level, and we've got to make sure that that policy that has been drafted has actually been implemented properly within the school. So we need to capture the key obligations out of the policy. We need to allocate them to an individual. We need to monitor and control whether those policy considerations are actually being put in place. And finally, we need to have a reporting process to say, well, if we didn't follow a particular policy, why not, and what were the implications of it, because that's how you get continuous improvement. So implementation of a risk policy framework, again, absolutely critical part of the process. Now, a third way of looking at this is what we'll call a good governance framework, and as we go through here, it's just another way of looking at the same sort of thing, but it's drawing the two concepts together. So you have your policy. Once you have a policy, you've got to communicate it effectively. It's got to be easy to reference, okay? The next part of the process is training and testing. You've got to take high-risk policies, and you've got to make sure people are trained, and you've got to make sure you've got records of that training having taken place. So again, no use in having an allergic reactions policy if no one knows about it, you haven't trained people. You need to keep records of those training, because if anything happens in the future, they'll be absolute vital as far as defending any litigation is concerned. And surveying becomes a key part of the process, because say for example we have a policy on bullying and we've communicated and we've trained and we've tested and we've got all the records, but we do a survey that says, has bullying occurred, and 90% of staff say they've been bullied, we know that we've got a problem in that particular area. So the top line here is all about policy management, okay? The second part of the process is, how do we know that the policies are actually being put into place and actually working? Now, it's making your policies come alive, and this is what we call the assurance part of the system. So assurance is capture a key risk, capture a compliance obligation, capture a complaint. Whenever you do that, you need to assign responsibility to an individual to manage that particular issue. You then need to monitor whether or not the individual has carried out that obligation. And if they haven't, you can control it through an escalation process. So if the person hasn't, for example, made sure that all the EpiPens are up to date, that could be escalated to another person within the school who can take control of that issue. And the next part up the line is reporting. Now, there are so many things that need to be done with schools. Some of them might be on a monthly basis, and suddenly what you find is you've got multiple iterations and tasks that need to be done. And it's impossible to look at all of those at once, so you report on an exception basis essentially. And what you're reporting is, well, what aren't we doing right? And when you look at that, you can come back go into the continuous improvement link, because usually it'll come back to the fact your policies and procedures have been deficient, or some element of your training or implementation has been deficient. So all of this comes back to how do you actually do it, and this we come back to this concept of a paper chase versus technology. And as far as our experience here is that we're still finding many organisations that have got you know, very thick manuals. They might have a 100-page manual or something like that, that has every policy and procedure of the school all wrapped into one. The problem with things like that is that they're nearly impossible to maintain, they're impossible to reference, they're impossible to communicate to staff, and they essentially don't work. So what schools tend to do, and most organisations tend to do, is throw people at the problem. We've got a different approach. We believe that you need to embrace technology. We call it organisational content integration. We believe that people, and most people, have very healthy brains and can think very clearly. Their problem is there's too much noise and complexity in their world. So there are just simply too many demands on them. So they might have so many obligations to do, they'll miss one simply because they're not being reminded, or it's not being highlighted to them that that's a really critical thing. If that hasn't been done, you know, we could have a disastrous risk event happening in the school. So how you're actually dealing with that is through what we call through the use of technology systems to enable the school to get to where the school needs to be. So now what I'll do is I'll just exit this screen, and I'm just going to show you a practical demonstration of how risk management works in practice. Now, what I'm going to do is just bear this in mind as you go through. So the first thing I'm going to look at is a policy management framework and the type of thing that schools should have in place. Okay. So here's an example of, this is actually a product of ours, but it's an example, and many schools will have a similar type of system. But the key is that what we found is that whilst a lot of schools have intranets for their students and for parents, and for teachers to post information to students and parents, a lot of schools actually don't have a similar type of intranet which just has the information that teachers need to know. Okay, so the key here is that we are setting out very clearly the different policies and procedures that the school will have. Just bear with me, I just need to find a note. Here we are. And so what we have here is set out very clearly down the side logical policy categorization. So for example, if I click on school governance, it will take me and I can see, oh, there's my risk management program, my compliance program, my complaints handling program. They're all logically categorized together. If I went down to human resources as an example, and you can again see a breakdown of policies into logical areas so they can be quickly accessed. And if I went down to, say, general terms and conditions of employment, and I wanted to go and look at email and internet usage, for example, then I can access that policy quickly. Now similarly, if I went into student duty of care and I went through the different types of programs and I said, okay, I really want to find excursions, again, very simple, and you can go into the excursion policies and find those quickly. But the 3 clicks rule, as we call it, the ability to find information at the, basically at the palm of your hand, is comes down also to be able to search your site. So here I've just searched for a compliance program, and again, in less than a couple of seconds, I can pull up my school's compliance program. I can look at all the different information in there. If I want to look at the different legal and regulatory issues, for example, this is actually set up for WA, but it would apply differently in different jurisdictions. I can look at, say, all the legal obligations, again, logically categorized. Go and look at things like education services delivery. I can see what my federal obligations are, see what my state obligations are, and if I wanted to go and have more information on, say, national quality framework, again, that information is at my fingertips. So it's easy to communicate. It's easy for people to reference and get that information. Now the key with all policies and procedures is we don't expect people to come into school every day and start reading policies and procedures. Once they've gone through initial induction training, this is really reference material. So the key is that you actually do train staff in relation to all the high risk and key policies that you need to do. So if I was just to, we've developed an internal training room, so if I was to look here, you see the different types of training. So if I took social media, for example, there's a training program on personal usage for social media that can be adapted to a school. Okay. Now, still we probably haven't gone far enough, because if you follow the methodology, we then also need to make sure that we've got a record that people have actually been trained. So you'll find a corresponding training course that sits with social media training. Very simple. It's not designed to be MBA type education. It's really compliance focused. It's getting the key messages across as to what we expect people to do, getting them to acknowledge those, and all of those, you know, getting an acknowledgement that people have read and understood a policy. And in this particular system, you need to keep records as well. So in this particular system, I'm just going into the back end of it. You look at an assessment module, and within the assessment module, we can quickly have a look at individual results. So if I look at my results, for example, I think I've only done one test, and it's on business continuity management, and you can see exactly when I did the test. You can see the one question that I got wrong, which makes that very, very easily accessible. It's information that is really important if you need to defend litigation. So if we go, that's what we'll call the fundamentals part of the program. So policies, communicate, train, test, keep records of those things, right? Now the second thing I want to go into and show you is what we call the assurance system. Now this is a really, really important part of the process. Now there are quite a few products in the market on which we'll call, it's generally referred to as GRC software, or governance, risk and compliance software. The particular product I'm showing you at the moment is produced by an Australian-based company called Ticket on Demand. This is we believe this is an excellent product, and as with all of these products, you know, the good quality ones make the complex simple, right? They actually they're easy to use, they're products that you really don't need all that much training in. You certainly don't need an IT person anywhere near them, okay? So if we go and just have a quick look at this, the key elements of all these types of programs is that you've got your risk management program, you've got your compliance program, in this case called tasks. You've got the ability to integrate incident reporting and incident management, because what you want to be able to do is link an incident to a risk, so you can see the types of risk indicators coming through. This program also has an internal audit feature, which I won't go into for the purposes of this demonstration, usually used by larger schools and larger organisations. And of course, every one of these types of systems has to have a very robust reporting capability. So let me go and take risk. So what we're looking at on the front page here is an individualized, so an individual would see the risks they're responsible for, the tasks that they are responsible for, and it's all in a nice summary that they can just see all of that information in one place. So if I was to go into the first risk up the top, might as well take the most extreme one, and the most extreme risk here is the complaints handling program risk. And now this takes me to the risk itself. Now you can see that the risk is that the schools failed to document a complaints handling program that adheres to the Western Australian registration standards. A similar risk would apply in any jurisdiction. Okay. Now we can have a risk flag. We can say that if we fail to do that, it could really affect the reputation of the school. We can have other flags such as, is this a matter that we want to report to the board? Is this, what type of risk this? Is it a strategic risk? Is it a financial risk? Is it an operational risk? All important stuff, because it allows you to get really high quality reporting outcomes out. But here we are going through the process. If you recall, we were talking about risk assessment. So you can look and say, well, what is almost certain, or 90% chance of, and you set your own definitions. That's what is referred to as setting your risk appetite within an organisation. And you can look at your likelihood definitions as well. And so I could just move this around and we'll just keep it where it is. Now the key is, what's our control effectiveness? If it was excellent, we would have a different profile on whether it was poor. An extreme risk with a poor control effectiveness is a major flag that something needs to be done within an organisation. So now you're asking, well, okay, how am I linking risk and compliance? How's that all come together? Well, you can see here that we have two tasks that have been allocated to mitigate this particular risk. Remembering the risk being about having not having a proper compliance framework in place. So now what we're going to do is we go through and have a look at this particular compliance obligation, and here the compliance obligation is a plain English question, always very important. You don't write a question such as, have we complied with XXX of the Education Act, because no one really knows what that is. You've got to take those types of obligations and you've got to turn them into plain English questions that when they're received by someone, they just know what it is instinctively. They need to be able to respond to it on the run, not have to go and look it up, okay? So what we have here is, we can see that, again, this particular one is part of a registration standard. We can even go down to the level of what registration standard it refers to. We can also see that it's linked to an international student obligation as we go down. Now, this obligation, this is a demo system, so obviously set to an admin user, but you can then allocate anyone in your organisation responsible for that particular task, and you can set the frequency on which they get that. Now, on a particular task like complaints, it's probably an annual type of question, unless you've got a particular risk profile attached to it. You can also force notes, so instead of when people say that they're compliant, they're forced to actually put a comment into the process, and you can force things like, reminders, so you could be reminded 30 days or 12 days or whatever you want before the obligation's due. So if I take that task and I go over to the home page again, you'll see that that task is actually in the list of things that need to be dealt with. So here it is here. So how this would work is an individual would get an email, it would come into their inbox, and that would direct them to this page, and then on the page they get all the tasks, whether they be incidents or risks or whatever they need to deal with, and then they can manage all of this from one simple list. So it's a very efficient way of managing key obligations. And that is simply answered by going through and saying, is the task compliant or non-compliant? We can see all the information in relation to the task here. You've got options to say that it's in progress and put percentage of progress. And once you've done that, it'll actually come up with a tick, and it'll say that that particular task has been answered. Okay. Now, again, just going back to the home page, a really key outcome here is for an administrator, for somebody who's actually responsible for the whole of risk and compliance in an organisation, you get these great summary reports. There's only very few risks here and obligations here, but in a normal organisation, these might go into the hundreds, and you can quickly identify. Oh, I wonder what that is. No, that's still overdue from 2 weeks ago, and I can go in quickly, and it will take me to the actual task, and I can go in and actually look at the task. I can see who's responsible, and I can quickly chase them up and ask them to actually deal with that. Now, the other part of the program that I just wanted to take you to was incidents. Now, when we talk about incidents, think about all those different things: compliance breaches, audit issues. It could be suggestion box. It could be a process where we just have a system where people can report a risk. And how this works is anyone can report one. It means that, say, on the teacher's intranet, any teacher could report a risk at any time. It would then be triaged. What would happen, it would come to this person responsible for risk, who would then look at it and determine whether that risk was appropriate to enter into your risk register. But that's how you start to develop a risk culture within an organisation. At the moment, what I'm just looking at is an external complaint. And if I go into that external complaint, essentially what these are forms. They're totally tailorable. You can put whatever fields you like. So you can see all the different types of fields, drop-down boxes, large text fields, all the sort of stuff that you want to do. And the methodology is that you get a form that is answered through, which anyone can fill out, and then it goes through to the person responsible, who then has to determine whether or not they submit that. They can reject a complaint or reject a compliance breach, or they can accept it. The other key here is you can start to link these complaints through to risks, and also you can set up a task. So the example that we have here is, I think the complaint was in relation to intranet usage. Again, that a parent complaining that the school intranet wasn't up to date, and therefore they couldn't see when assignment dates were due and things like that. You know, not a major complaint, it's more like quality feedback. So that then going through the system allows you to deal with that, and in this case we set up a task, and the task would be to send to a person in the organisation a task to make sure that all the teachers are notified and are reminded to make sure that they keep that up to date. So you can see the continuous improvement part of the process going through there. Now, if you want to get the information out of this is as easy as this. You just click Export to PDF, and suddenly you'll have a PDF document that summarizes everything to do with that complaint. Now, this is incredibly useful for having to go into staff meetings and so on and so forth, that you can just extract the data that quickly. You know, anyone can do it. You're not running reports. And with that, I'll move on to the next part of the final part of the process, which is just to look at reports. Now, again, in the interest of time, I won't go through all of these. I'll just run one report, but I'll just give you an example. Pretty much anything that you need to get out, you can get out of systems like this. So, for example, I'll run a risk task framework report. Now, what that report is a report that's showing me my risks in a particular area, and I'll just run it for human resources at the moment, and the mitigating tasks that I put across that. Now, I'll just put it up into preview mode, and what you'll be able to quickly see is, for example, here's a risk which is there's a lack of clarity with respect to staff reporting lines, okay? And the compliance obligation, or the mitigator here, the risk control, is a question going to someone making sure that they've got a clear organisation chart that's been published on a regular basis, okay? So that's the sort of level of information that you can get down to. The key thing with systems like this, if I want to add something else, like I just wanted to add control effectiveness, it'll drop down here, and then if I wanted to sort my report differently, I just drag and drop it and move it to here. If I wanted to sort differently, I can just say, okay, I'm going to sort by residual risk, and then I'll have high to low or low to high, and I can group it in you know, 2 columns or 1. So all of this allows me to very quickly format reports, and I can look at my page setups. It's a very easy system to use. So, and this is really important because you need to have a system that is easy to use. If it's got any barrier to use, you're going to have problems making this work. But systems like these actually put you in control. They're incredibly simple to use, and they're incredibly intuitive. Okay, so that's the essence of the overview of the program, looking at fundamentals, which is your policy management, and then looking at the data management, so making sure that risks and compliance obligations and incidents are all managed and controlled, that pulls out that information. So like the Year 8 example about intranet use, okay, we pulled it out, it's been reported, now we're going to improve our processes by making sure that our policies and our training of staff is improved in that particular area, so we avoid that risk in the future. Now I'll just go back into the presentation just to finish off. This is an interesting one. When we talk about risk management, sometimes I wish that we never invented the term risk management and that we just talked about good management. Because if you think about what I've talked about today, it is simply good management. It's as simple as that. It's an integration of good management. It's about transparency of policies and procedures, implementing them, and getting data out, reporting at different levels in the organisation. Ultimately, I always like this diagram that shows us, look, here's an organisation that's very dysfunctional. You've got different people standing in different silos, looking in different directions, wasting resources, and so on and so forth. If you haven't seen an organisation like that, I'd imagine you haven't lived, because I'm sure we've all worked in an organisation like that at some stage. The problem with this is the productivity issues. There's incredibly low productivity because everything's not linked together. So the idea of risk management and enterprise risk management and governance and risk and compliance integration is pulling this all together, so the information flows very clearly and seamlessly through the organisation, and particularly up to the Board of Governors, who have a very clear and transparent view of what they need to achieve, and to the management team. And just to finalise and to wrap up, I just wanted to note that we've got a couple of different ways to connect. One is on a LinkedIn site, which is Australian School Governance. It's only just been established. I think there aren't that many members at the moment, but the idea is to share information about risk and compliance and information in relation to schools. There is a Twitter account, which is School Governance. There's a blog that you can see there as well, and of course there's our website. So that's the end of the presentation. I hope you enjoyed the webinar, and we will see you on the next occasion.